I was 11 years old when I first heard the whispers. They came to me in the space between sleeping and waking, in that threshold hour when the world grows thin and the veil that separates the real from the unreal becomes gossamer frail. And at first I believed them to be nothing more than the remnants of dreams, the echoes of nightmares that had not yet fully released their grip upon my consciousness. I was a child of Hive Secundus on Mordian, daughter of a manufactorum overseer and a woman who cleaned the hab blocks of the administratum clerks, and I had no framework for understanding what was happening to me, no language for the horror that was slowly flowering within the meat of my mind. The whispers spoke of things I could not comprehend, of hungers that existed beyond the boundaries of flesh, of intelligences that dwelt in the spaces between moments, of a sea of souls that churned and roiled beneath the thin skin of reality, waiting for the cracks through which they might pour. I did not know it then. I could not have known. But in that moment, I had become something other than human. Or perhaps I had always been something other, and the whispers were merely the announcement of a truth that had been written into my blood before I drew my first breath. I am a sanctioned Psyker of the Imperium of man. I am a weapon. I am a curse made useful, a disease transformed into medicine, a horror sanctified by the golden throne and pressed into service against the very darkness from which my power flows. I have walked through the screaming holds of the black ships. I have knelt in the binding chambers beneath the palace of terror. I have felt the gaze of the Emperor himself sear through the architecture of my soul and leave behind only ash and purpose. And I have served for 37 years in the regiments of the Astra Militarum, a living conduit for powers that no mortal mind was meant to channel, feared by those I protect, despised by those I serve beside, and hunted by things that exist only to devour what I am. This is my testimony. This is what it means to be born wrong in a galaxy that permits no mercy for the different, the cursed, the touched. This is what it feels like to carry the warp within you like a second heartbeat, to know that every breath you draw brings you closer to the moment when the things that whisper will finally find their way in, when the walls of your sanity will finally crumble, when you will become the very horror you have spent your life fighting against. I tell you this not for sympathy. Sympathy is a luxury the Imperium cannot afford. I tell you this so that you might understand. The powers manifested slowly at first, in ways that could almost be explained, almost be ignored, almost be attributed to coincidence or imagination, or the fevered dreams of a child who worked too many hours in the repsych processing chambers and breathed too much of the chemical-laden air. I knew when the shift supervisors were coming, before their footsteps could be heard. I felt the deaths of workers on the levels above and below me, brief flickers of extinguished light that registered somewhere behind my eyes like distant candle flames being snuffed. I dreamed of places I had never been, of wars I could not have witnessed, of a golden figure seated upon a throne of screaming souls, and I woke with the taste of blood in my mouth and the certainty that something vast and terrible had turned its attention toward me. My mother noticed first. Mothers always do. She saw the way I flinched before the voxcasters announced their warnings. She saw the way I refused to sleep in the dark, not because I feared what I might find there, but because I feared what might find me. She saw the way my eyes sometimes lost their focus, staring at things that existed in no spectrum visible to normal sight, and she understood, as all citizens of the Imperium are taught to understand, what I was becoming: a witch, a mutant, a psyker. The words are spoken as curses in the hives. They are whispered like prayers of warding, accompanied by the sign of the Aquila, by the touching of devotional icons, by the quiet hope that such corruption will never touch one's own bloodline. I learned later that across the million worlds of the Imperium, tens of thousands of children manifest psychic abilities every day, some weak and easily suppressed, some so powerful that they tear holes in reality before their minds can comprehend what they have done. Most die. Most are killed by their own families, by their neighbors, by the Arbites or the ecclesiarchy, or the simple, brutal mathematics of a galaxy that cannot afford to let the cursed live uncontrolled. Those who survive the first manifestation, those who are not immediately consumed by the things that hunger in the warp, those who are not torn apart by mobs or executed by frightened authorities, they are collected. The black ships come for them. The black ships came for me. I remember the day they arrived. I remember the way the hive itself seemed to hold its breath, the way the manufacturum shifts fell silent, the way every eye turned toward the spire port where the vessel descended through the chemical clouds like a black blade cutting through infected flesh. I did not know what it was. I did not know what it meant, but I felt it. Felt the null field that surrounded the ship like a sphere of absolute silence. Felt the way the whispers that had become my constant companions suddenly retreated, screaming into the depths of my consciousness. Felt for the first time in months the terrible, beautiful silence of a mind that was truly alone. My mother had already reported me. She had done it 3 days before, weeping as she filled out the forms, knowing that she was condemning her only daughter to a fate she could not imagine. I do not blame her. I cannot blame her. She had been taught since birth that to harbour a Psyker was to invite damnation upon one's entire bloodline, that the corruption would spread like a cancer through the family, through the hab block, through the hive itself, until nothing remained but screaming and madness, and the laughter of things that wore human faces but were not, had never been human. She was protecting everyone else. She was doing her duty. This was love in the Imperium. This was mercy. They came for me in the night, figures in black carapace armor, emblazoned with the symbol of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, their faces hidden behind rebreathers that hissed with each exhalation, their movements precise and practiced and utterly without hesitation. They did not explain. They did not comfort. They simply took me, lifting my small body as though I weighed nothing, carrying me through corridors that had been cleared of all witnesses, down through access shafts that I had not known existed, out into the chem-laden night where a transport waited with its engines already cycling. I saw my mother one last time, standing in the doorway of our hab unit, her face wet with tears, that the acid rain was already beginning to burn. She made the sign of the Aquila. She mouthed words I could not hear. I never saw her again. I never learned if she survived. I never learned if the grief of what she had done consumed her, or if she found peace in the knowledge that she had done her duty. These are questions that will remain unanswered until the day the warp finally claims what remains of my soul, and perhaps not even then, for the warp cares nothing for the small concerns of mortal hearts. The transport rose. The hive fell away beneath me, and I understood in that moment of terrible clarity that the child I had been was already dead, that she had died the moment the whispers first began, the moment the warp first touched her mind, the moment she became something that the Imperium could not ignore and could not destroy, and could only, with great effort and greater cost, attempt to use. I was 11 years old. I was no longer human. And the journey to the black ships, that long voyage through the screaming dark to the heart of the Imperium itself, was only beginning. This is what awaits every Psyker born within the Emperor's domain. This is the mercy of the Imperium. Not death, but purpose. Not destruction, but transformation into a weapon that can be wielded against the very forces that created us. I did not understand it then. I understand it now. The holds of the Black Ship were not designed for comfort, nor for dignity, nor for any of the small mercies that civilized peoples extend to one another in acknowledgement of their shared humanity. They were designed for containment. They were designed for suppression. They were designed to hold the broken and the cursed in conditions that would keep them alive long enough to reach their destination, and not one moment longer than necessary. For every moment a Psyker drew breath was a moment in which the warp might find purchase, might slip through the cracks in reality that we represented, might pour into the material universe and drown everything in madness and fire. I learned this in the darkness. I learned this surrounded by the weeping of children. There were hundreds of us in that hold, perhaps thousands. I could not see well enough to count, could not focus my thoughts clearly enough to estimate. For the null field that permeated the ship pressed down upon my consciousness like a weight of black iron, crushing the whispers into silence but crushing much else besides. We lay in rows upon metal grating, our wrists bound in suppression manacles that hummed with frequencies designed to disrupt psychic activity, our bodies separated by barely a hand's width, our breath mingling in the recycled air until it became a single exhalation of fear and despair, and the particular smell of humans who have been denied washing facilities for too long. The smell never leaves you. Even now, 37 years later, I sometimes wake in the night with that stench in my nostrils, sweat and urine, and the copper-sweet undertone of blood from those who had injured themselves in their restraints, all of it underlaid by the chemical tang of the suppressant drugs they pumped through the ventilation system to keep us docile, to keep us quiet, to keep us from reaching out with our minds and touching the things that waited just beyond the hull. I was 11 years old. The boy beside me was perhaps 8, perhaps younger. It was difficult to tell in the darkness, difficult to judge anything when the null field made every thought feel like wading through cold tar. He wept without sound, his small body shaking with sobs that he had learned to silence, and I understood without being told that he had learned this lesson the hard way, that somewhere in the days or weeks before I had arrived, he had cried aloud and had been taught the cost of drawing attention to oneself. I did not comfort him. I could not. The suppression manacles prevented me from moving my arms, and the drugs in my system prevented me from forming the words. But I pressed my shoulder against his, just slightly, just enough for him to feel that he was not alone in that darkness, and after a time his shaking subsided into stillness. His name was Ven. He told me this later, in the brief moments when the guards came to distribute our nutrient paste and we were permitted to speak. He was from a world called Cephris Secundus, a mining colony on the edge of the Calixis sector, and he had manifested his powers by accidentally stopping his father's heart during a nightmare. He did not know if his father had survived. He did not know if his mother had forgiven him. He knew only that men in black armor had come, and that his life before that moment had ended as completely as if he had died. I never saw Ven again after we reached Terra. I do not know if he survived the sanctioning process. I do not know if he was deemed too weak and fed to the Golden Throne, his soul burned away to fuel the Astronomicon for a few precious seconds, or if he was deemed too dangerous and executed in the chambers beneath the palace, or if he emerged as I did, hollowed out and rebuilt into something the Imperium could use. I have carried his name with me for 37 years, a small weight among the many I bear, a reminder that even in the darkest holds of the darkest ships, humanity persists in its need for connection. The voyage lasted 3 months. I know this now, though I did not know it then. Time had become meaningless in that lightless hold, measured only by the intervals between feeding, between the changing of our waste receptacles, between the screams that sometimes echoed through the metal walls, when one of us lost control, when the suppressants failed, when the warp found its way in despite every precaution. I witnessed 7 deaths during that voyage, 7 souls who could not endure what was being done to them, who broke under the weight of the null field, or the isolation, or the simple, crushing despair of understanding what awaited them. Some died quietly, their hearts simply stopping in the night, their bodies discovered only when the guards came for the morning feeding and found flesh that had gone cold and rigid. Others died loudly, catastrophically, their powers surging beyond the capacity of the suppression manacles to contain, their bodies becoming conduits for energies that should never have touched the material realm. I remember the 3rd death most clearly, a woman, perhaps 30 years of age, who had been silent for the entire voyage, who had eaten her nutrient paste without complaint and had submitted to every indignity without resistance. I had thought her broken, emptied of everything that might once have made her dangerous. I was wrong. She began to speak in tongues, not the tongues of any human language, but something older, something that had never been meant for human vocal cords, sounds that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and register directly in the meat of the brain. The temperature in the hold dropped so rapidly that frost began to form on the metal grating, on our skin, on the inside of our lungs with every breath we drew. I saw her rise, though her manacles should have prevented it, saw her body lift from the grating as though gravity had simply ceased to apply to her, saw her eyes roll back until only the whites showed, whites that were not white at all, but filled with something that moved, something that churned, something that looked back at us with a hunger that had been building since before our species learned to walk upright. The Sisters of Silence came. I felt them before I saw them, felt the null field intensify until it was no longer pressure but pain, until my thoughts scattered like insects fleeing a fire, until I could barely remember my own name. They moved through the hold, like ghosts in golden armor, their presence an absolute negation of everything the woman had become. And when they reached her, when their null auras touched the thing that was wearing her flesh, she simply collapsed, crumpled like a puppet whose strings had been cut, and the thing that had been looking out through her eyes retreated back into whatever hell had spawned it. They carried her body away. They did not tell us if she was alive or dead. They did not need to. We had all seen what she had become, what we might become, what waited for us in the spaces between moments if our control ever slipped, if our will ever faltered, if we ever forgot for even an instant the terrible responsibility that our curse had placed upon us. This was our first lesson. This was the truth that the black ships taught to every Psyker who survived the voyage. You are not victims, you are not innocents. You are not children who deserve protection and comfort, and the gentle lies that parents tell to shield their young from the horrors of the universe. You are weapons that have not yet been aimed. You are diseases that have not yet found their hosts. You are doors that have not yet been opened, and behind those doors wait things that would unmake reality itself if given the chance. The Imperium does not hate us. The Imperium cannot afford to hate us. Hatred is personal, intimate, a relationship between individuals who recognize each other's humanity. What the Imperium feels for us is something colder, something more practical, the wariness of a man who must handle venomous serpents, who knows that they serve a purpose, who uses them to kill the rats that would otherwise devour his grain, but who never forgets, not for a single moment, that they could turn and sink their fangs into his flesh at any time. We are necessary. We are useful. We are, in our own terrible way, indispensable to the continued survival of human civilization. But we are not trusted. We are never trusted. And in the holds of the black ships, surrounded by the weeping of children, and the stench of fear, and the memory of a woman whose eyes had become windows to hell, I understood for the first time why this was so. I understood, and I did not blame them. The ship translated into real space above Terra on the 93rd day of our voyage. I felt it happen, felt the screaming transition from the immaterium back into the realm of matter and physics and sanity, felt the warp recede like a tide pulling back from a shore, leaving behind only the faint psychic residue of its passage, and the knowledge that we had survived something that killed thousands of ships every year, that swallowed entire fleets and spat out nothing but madness and corruption. Through the metal walls of the hold, through the suppression field and the drugs and the exhaustion that had settled into my bones like lead, I felt something else, something vast, something that burned with a light that was not light, that existed in spectrums that human eyes could not perceive, but that human souls could not ignore. The Emperor, the master of mankind, the corpse god who was not dead, who had never been dead, who endured in agony upon his throne of gold and suffering, so that humanity might survive for one more day, one more year, one more millennium. I felt him, and I understood, truly understood, for the first time, the scale of what I had become part of. Not a child taken from her mother, not a victim of circumstance, not a single small tragedy in a universe full of tragedies. I was a thread in a tapestry that stretched across 1,000,000 worlds, a note in a symphony that had been playing for 10,000 years, a single cell in an organism so vast that my mind could not encompass it, an organism that was fighting for its survival against forces that would reduce everything humanity had ever built to ash and memory. The holds opened. Light poured in, real light, not the flickering illumination of glow globes, but the golden radiance of Sol itself, filtered through the orbital platforms that ringed Holy Terror. I raised my hand to shield my eyes, and I saw for the first time the faces of my fellow passengers, hundreds of children and adults blinking in the sudden brightness, their features gaunt and pale from months of darkness, their eyes holding the same mixture of terror and desperate hope that I knew must be reflected in my own. We had arrived, we had survived, and the true horror was only beginning. They marched us through the streets of the Imperial Palace in chains, not chains of iron, though there were those as well, suppression manacles around our wrists and ankles, linked by lengths of blessed adamantine that had been inscribed with wards and hexagrammic seals by the Ordo Hereticus itself. No, the chains I speak of were chains of a different kind, chains forged from the weight of 10,000 staring eyes, from the hatred and fear that radiated from every serf and servant and menial who lined the corridors to watch us pass. They made the sign of the Aquila as we shuffled by. They whispered prayers of warding. They looked upon us as one might look upon a procession of the damned, which, I suppose, is precisely what we were. I saw the palace that day, though I did not truly see it. My mind was too fractured by the journey, too suppressed by the null fields that permeated every stone and every shadow of that holy place, to appreciate the magnificence through which we walked. I caught only glimpses, walls of gold that rose higher than any hive spire I had known, murals depicting battles that had shaped the fate of the galaxy, statues of warriors in armor that gleamed like captured starlight, and everywhere, the Aquila, the two-headed eagle that watched from every surface, that judged with its 4 eyes, that reminded us with every step that we walk through the heart of humanity's dominion, and that we were the lowest, the most wretched, the most dangerous things permitted to exist within its sacred bounds. They brought us to the Scholastica Sicana, the great fortress monastery where psychers are broken and remade, where the curse is transformed into a tool, where children learn to become weapons or die in the attempt. I remember the gates, black iron taller than hab blocks, inscribed with warnings in 100 languages, flanked by statues of hooded figures whose stone eyes seemed to follow us as we passed. I remember the smell, incense and ozone and something else beneath it, something that I would later learn to recognize as the particular scent of psychic discharge, of minds pushed beyond their limits, of souls straining against barriers that were never meant to hold. I remember the screaming. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a constant background noise that permeated the Scholastica like the hum of machinery in a manufactorum. Some of it was audible, the ordinary screaming of human voices pushed past endurance, but much of it was something else entirely. Psychic screaming, the silent shrieks of minds being tested and trained and torn apart, echoing through the warp in frequencies that only we could perceive. Within an hour of my arrival, I had learned to filter it out, to push it to the edges of my consciousness, where it became merely another texture in the fabric of my new existence. You learn in the Scholastica. You learn or you die. The first test came that same day. They separated us into groups of 20, led us into chambers that had been prepared for our evaluation, and there, one by one, they measured us. Not our bodies, though those were catalogued as well, every scar and blemish recorded in ledgers that would follow us for the rest of our lives. They measured our souls. They measured the depth of our connection to the warp, the strength of our gifts, the stability of our minds, the likelihood that we would one day lose control and become conduits for the very forces we were being trained to fight. I watched as children I had traveled with for 3 months were sorted into categories I did not yet understand. Some were led away to the right, toward corridors that echoed with the sounds of training and discipline. Others were led to the left, towards silence, toward doors that closed behind them with a finality that needed no explanation. And some, the weakest, the most unstable, the ones whose gifts were too faint to be useful or too wild to be controlled, were taken downward into depths that none of us wished to contemplate. I learned later what awaited them in those depths. I learned about the Golden Throne and its endless hunger, about the 1,000 souls that must be sacrificed each day to keep the Astronomicon burning, about the pyres of psychic fuel upon which the Imperium's navigation depends. Those children, those weak and broken and unstable children, who had committed no crime except being born with minds that touched the warp, they became fuel. They became the fire that lights humanity's way through the darkness between stars. I did the mathematics once, in the years that followed. 1,000 souls per day, 365,000 per year, 3,650,000,000 souls across the 10 millennia since the Emperor ascended to his throne. And this is merely one cost among many, one sacrifice among the countless sacrifices that keep the Imperium breathing for one more day. I was sorted to the right. I was deemed useful. I do not know if this was mercy or cruelty. The training began immediately. They gave us no time to grieve, no time to process, no time to mourn the lives we had lost or the futures that had been stolen from us. Time, they taught us, was a luxury that psychers could not afford. Every moment we spent unprepared was a moment in which the warp might find us vulnerable, might slip through the cracks in our defenses, might transform us from weapons into threats that would need to be put down. And so we trained. We trained until our minds bled and our bodies collapsed. We trained until the barriers between self and other became fluid, until we could feel the thoughts of those around us like pressure against our skin, until we could reach into the warp and draw forth fire and lightning and forces that had no name in any human tongue. We trained until the things that whispered in the darkness became familiar, until we could recognize their voices, until we knew which ones could be ignored and which ones would devour us whole if we gave them even a moment's purchase. I excelled. This is not pride. Pride is a luxury I abandoned long ago, along with hope and comfort and the belief that my life was my own. I excelled because I had no choice, because the alternative was death or worse than death, because I had seen what happened to those who failed, and I had decided, in whatever small part of my soul remained my own, that I would not join them in the fire. My instructors were not impressed by my excellence. They were never impressed. Impression implies investment, implies care, implies the recognition of individual worth. And in the Scholastica Psychana, we had no individual worth. We were raw material to be refined. We were ore to be smelted. We were, at best, promising components in a machine that stretched across 1,000,000 worlds. And the machine did not care if its components were proud of themselves. The soul binding came in my 3rd year. I had heard of it, of course. We all had. It was spoken of in whispers among the students, in rumors that grew more terrible with each telling, in the haunted eyes of those who had survived the process and emerged, changed. Some called it a blessing. The direct touch of the Emperor himself, a connection to the master of mankind that would protect us from the predations of the warp. Others called it what it truly was, a mutilation of the soul, a branding of the spirit, a trauma so profound that many did not survive it. Both descriptions were true. Both were incomplete. They came for me in the night, as they always do. Hooded figures in robes of black and gold, their faces hidden, their voices speaking words in languages I did not recognize. They led me down, deep into the bowels of the palace, through corridors that grew older and darker with each step, past wards and seals that made my skin crawl and my mind recoil, until at last we reached a chamber that had been ancient when humanity first learned to kindle fire. The chamber was circular, its walls covered in gold leaf that had tarnished to the color of old blood, its ceiling lost in shadows that no light could penetrate. In its center stood an altar of black stone, and upon that altar lay the instruments of my transformation, needles and blades and devices whose purpose I could not fathom, all of them arranged with the precision of surgical tools, all of them waiting for me. I was not the only one. There were 11 others, children and adults who had been selected for binding on the same day, their faces pale in the flickering light of torches that burned with flames that were not quite natural. We were arranged in a circle around the altar, our hands bound, our eyes fixed on the hooded figures who moved among us with the calm efficiency of priests performing a ritual they had performed 10,000 times before. And then the chamber opened, and he was there. Not physically. The Emperor has not moved from his throne in 10 millennia, has not spoken with a voice of flesh and air since the day Horus struck him down. But his presence filled that chamber, like water filling a vessel, like light filling a void, like pain filling every nerve and synapse of my being, until I could not tell where I ended and he began. I cannot describe what I felt. Human language was not designed for such experiences, was not built to contain the weight of a mind that had existed for tens of thousands of years, that had witnessed the birth and death of civilizations, that had loved humanity with a ferocity that would burn worlds, and had been betrayed by that love in ways that would break lesser beings into dust. I felt his attention turn toward me, and I understood, in that single, searing moment, what it meant to be truly seen, to be known in every detail of my being, to have every secret and every shame and every small, precious hope laid bare before a gaze that had looked upon the face of gods and found them wanting. He did not speak. He did not need to. His will pressed into my soul like a brand pressed into flesh, and I felt something within me change, something fundamental and irreversible, something that would mark me as his for whatever remained of my existence. The walls of my mind, which I had spent 3 years learning to build, were reinforced with something stronger than anything I could have constructed on my own. Barriers of golden light that would hold against the whispers that would keep the things in the darkness at bay, that would ensure that I remained a weapon pointed outward rather than a door through which horror might pour. It was agony. It was ecstasy. It was the death of everything I had been, and the birth of something new, something less human, but more useful, something that the Imperium could trust, or at least trust enough to send into battle against its enemies. I screamed. We all screamed. 3 of the 12 did not survive. Their minds simply collapsed under the weight of his attention, their souls snuffed out like candles in a hurricane, their bodies left as empty shells that breathed and blinked, but would never again house anything resembling consciousness. When it was over, when his presence withdrew and left us gasping on the floor of that ancient chamber, I opened my eyes and discovered that I could no longer see. The binding had burned away my sight, as it burns away the sight of all who undergo it, leaving only the psychic senses that would serve me for the rest of my days. I wept. I wept for the eyes I had lost, for the girl I had been, for the mother I would never see again, even if by some miracle our paths should cross. I wept because I understood, finally and completely, what the Imperium had made of me. Not a soldier, not a servant, not even a weapon, though that is what they called us. A sacrifice. A soul marked for burning. A candle lit against the darkness, destined to be consumed by the very light it cast. This was my sanctioning. This was my rebirth. And the war, the endless, eternal war that would define every remaining moment of my existence, was about to begin. They assigned me to the 47th Mordian Iron Guard on the day of my 23rd birthday, though I did not know it was my birthday until a clerk mentioned the date while processing my transfer orders. Birthdays are not celebrated in the Scholastica Psyker. Birthdays imply that the passage of time is something to be marked, something to be treasured. And we had learned long ago that time was merely the measure of how long we had left before the warp claimed us. I arrived at the regiment's staging grounds on Cypra Mundi, with nothing but the robes on my back, the staff in my hand, and the brand upon my soul. The soldiers watched me disembark from the transport with eyes that held no welcome, no curiosity, no recognition of shared humanity. They saw only what I was, a witch, a psyker, a necessary evil that had been attached to their regiment by order of the Departamento Munitorum, a weapon they would be forced to fight alongside, but would never, could never, accept as one of their own. I did not blame them. I had learned by then not to expect acceptance. Colonel Vasquez was the first to speak to me directly. He was a hard man, carved from the same iron that gave his regiment its name, his face a map of scars earned across 30 years of service to the Golden Throne. He looked upon me with an expression I had come to know well, the wariness of a soldier who has been handed a weapon he does not trust, who knows he must use it, but fears what might happen if it misfires. "You will stay at the rear of any engagement," he said, his voice carrying no emotion, no inflection, nothing that might suggest he saw me as anything more than equipment to be deployed. "You will act only when ordered. You will submit to weekly examinations by the regiment's commissar. And if you show any sign at all, of corruption or loss of control, you will be executed immediately. Do you understand? I understood. I had always understood. Yes, Colonel, I said. I am a weapon of the Imperium. Point me at the enemy. He nodded once and turned away. It was the longest conversation we would have for the next 6 years. The battles began almost immediately. The 47th had been deployed to the Sabbat Worlds Crusade, that great grinding conflict that consumed entire sectors and devoured regiments like a fire devours kindling. I saw my first combat on a world called Formal Prime, a hive world that had fallen to the arch-enemy, its population twisted into something that was no longer human, its cities transformed into charnel houses, where the laws of reality had begun to fray and tear. I will not describe the fighting in detail. War is not a story to be told. It is an experience to be survived, a trauma to be endured, a weight that settles into the bones and never fully lifts. I will tell you only what it felt like to be a Psyker on those battlefields, to carry the warp within me like a second heart, while chaos raged on every side. I felt them before I saw them, the enemy, the corrupted, the things that had once been human and had chosen, or been forced, to serve powers that existed only to unmake everything the Emperor had built. They burned in my psychic sight like wounds in the fabric of reality, their souls twisted into configurations that hurt to perceive, their very existence an offense against the order that the Imperium struggled to maintain. And behind them, pressing close against the thin membrane that separated the material universe from the immaterium, I felt other things, intelligences vast and hungry and patient, watching the battle with eyes that existed in no dimension I could name, waiting for the moment when the bloodshed would thin the veil enough for them to reach through. The first time I used my powers in combat, I killed 17 men with a single thought. They were cultists, followers of the dark gods who had been charging our position with weapons raised and prayers to their blasphemous masters on their lips. I felt the colonel's order before he spoke it, felt his desperate need, his fear that the line would break, his willingness to use any weapon at his disposal, even if that weapon terrified him. And so I reached into the warp, into that screaming sea of souls and hungers that churned beneath the skin of reality, and I drew forth fire. It was not fire as you understand it. It was not combustion, not oxidation, not the chemical reaction that turns fuel to ash. It was something older, something purer, something that existed in the space between physics and nightmare. It burst from my hands in a torrent of white gold flame that struck the charging cultists and consumed them utterly. Flesh and bone and armor and soul, all of it reduced to ash in the span of a single heartbeat, all of it unmade by powers that no mortal mind should ever have been permitted to wield. 17 souls, 17 lives ended by my will alone. I felt each one as it was extinguished. I felt their terror in that final moment, their disbelief, their desperate prayers to gods who either could not or would not save them. And beneath it all, I felt something else, a whisper of satisfaction that did not come from me, a hunger that had been fed, a darkness that had grown just slightly stronger, because I had opened myself to the warp and let its power flow through me. This is what it means to be a sanctioned Psyker. This is the bargain we make with every use of our gifts. We are not merely weapons, we are doors, and every time we open ourselves to the power that flows from the immaterium, we risk letting something through that should never be permitted to exist in the material realm. The brands upon our souls, the barriers that the Emperor himself inscribed into our minds, they help, they protect, but they do not make us safe. Nothing could make us safe. We are, all of us, one moment of weakness, away from becoming the very horrors we fight against. The years passed. Campaigns blurred together into a continuous stream of blood and fire and screaming, of worlds saved and worlds lost, of victories that cost more than they were worth, and defeats that should have broken us but somehow did not. I killed hundreds with my powers. Thousands, perhaps. I stopped counting after formal prime, stopped trying to keep track of the souls I had sent screaming into whatever awaited them beyond the veil. The numbers had become meaningless, abstract figures that could not capture the weight of what I had done, what I continued to do, what I would do until the day the warp finally claimed me. I watched the soldiers of the 47th grow accustomed to my presence, if not accepting of it. They learned to position themselves behind me when the fighting grew fierce, learned to trust that my flames would burn only the enemy, learned to see me as a useful tool rather than an imminent threat. Some of them even spoke to me occasionally, brief exchanges about weather or rations, or the rumors that filtered down from command, conversations that pretended I was human, that pretended we were comrades rather than weapon and wielder. I treasured those moments. I hoarded them like precious gems, stored them in the corners of my memory where the whispers could not reach. They were proof that humanity persisted, that even in the darkest depths of the galaxy's eternal war, connection was still possible. Kindness could still exist. And then came Vergast. Vergast was a hive world, one of the primary manufacturing centers of the Sabbat worlds, its forges producing the weapons and ammunition that fed the Crusades' endless hunger. When the archenemy came for it, they came in force. Millions of cultists and traitor guardsmen, and things that had never been human at all, pouring across the planet's surface like a tide of corruption, drowning everything in their path. The 47th was deployed to defend Vervenheave, the planet's primary population center. 40 million souls huddled behind walls of adamantine and faith, praying to an emperor who could not hear them, hoping that the soldiers who stood between them and annihilation would be enough. We were not enough. We were never enough. The siege lasted for months. I do not remember how many. Time had lost all meaning by then, measured only in the intervals between assaults, in the brief moments of exhausted sleep stolen between bombardments, in the steady dwindling of our numbers as the enemy ground us down through sheer weight of bodies and firepower. I used my powers until my mind bled, until the barriers the Emperor had inscribed upon my soul began to crack and fray, until I could no longer tell where my thoughts ended and the whispers began. And then, on a day that I will carry with me, until the warp finally claims what remains of my soul, the wall fell. I was stationed in Sector 17 when it happened, positioned behind a barricade of rubble and corpses, surrounded by the remnants of a platoon that had once numbered 40 and now counted 11. The enemy had been probing our defenses for hours, testing for weaknesses, sacrificing thousands of their own to find the cracks in our line, and they found one. I felt the moment the wall breached, felt the surge of corrupt joy that radiated from the enemy forces, felt the despair that washed through our own soldiers like a physical wave, felt the sudden terrible certainty that everything we had fought for, everything we had sacrificed, was about to be swept away in a tide of blood and fire. They poured through the breach like water through a broken dam, not hundreds, not thousands, but tens of thousands of screaming, howling, corrupted bodies, their eyes burning with the light of the dark gods, their mouths twisted into grins that belonged on no human face. Behind them came worse things, demons, creatures of the warp given flesh and form, entities that should never have been permitted to exist in the material realm, but had been summoned by the blood that had been spilled, drawn through the weakened veil by the sheer weight of suffering that permeated Vervenheave. I saw a soldier named Merrick torn apart by something that had too many arms and not enough face. I saw a woman named Chen consumed by fire that burned from within, her body becoming a torch that screamed with her voice as the flames devoured everything she had been. I saw things that I cannot describe because human language does not contain the words, horrors that I have spent decades trying to forget and never will. And then I felt it, the presence, the attention. Something vast and terrible had turned its gaze upon me. Not the minor entities that scrabbled at the edges of my consciousness, not the whispers that had been my constant companions since childhood. This was something older, something greater, something that existed on a scale that dwarfed planets, that dwarfed stars, that dwarfed everything I had ever conceived of as large or powerful or significant. It looked upon me with an interest that was not quite hunger, not quite curiosity, something in between that had no name in any language humanity had ever spoken. I felt my barriers begin to fail, felt the golden light that the Emperor had inscribed upon my soul begin to flicker and dim, felt the thing's attention pressing against my mind like a weight of infinite darkness, searching for the cracks, searching for the way in, searching for the door that I had always been and had always feared I would one day become. And in that moment, that single, eternal moment when everything hung in the balance, I made a choice. I did not surrender. I did not break. I did not become the door through which that vast and terrible presence might pour itself into the material realm. Instead, I burned. I gathered every fragment of power I possessed, every reserve I had been hoarding, every scrap of psychic strength that remained to me after months of siege and slaughter. I pulled it all together into a single point of light within my chest, a star born from desperation and faith, and the absolute refusal to let the darkness win. And then I let it go. The explosion of light scoured the breach clean. It burned the corrupted and the demonic alike, reduced them to ash and less than ash, unmade them so completely that not even their echoes remained in the warp. It sealed the wound in reality that their presence had torn, cauterized it with fire that was not fire, but something purer, something that carried within it a fragment of the Emperor's own light, the light that I had carried since my binding, the light that I had never truly understood until that moment. The vast presence recoiled. Its attention withdrew, not in defeat, but in something that might have been surprise, might have been respect, might have been nothing more than the calculation that this particular door was not worth the cost of forcing open. I collapsed. The world went dark around me, darker than the blindness that had been my companion since the binding, darker than any darkness I had ever known. And in that darkness, I heard a voice, not the whispers, not the hunger of the warp, but something else entirely, something that spoke without words, that communicated in pure meaning, rather than language. You are not yet done. That was all. 4 words, or perhaps no words at all, merely the impression of a message received and understood. And then I was being lifted, carried by hands that I could not see, borne away from the breach that I had sealed at the cost of everything I had. I woke 3 days later in a medici bay, my body broken, my mind fractured, my soul scorched by the power I had channeled. The commissar was there, standing over my bed, with a look on his face that I could not read with my ruined eyes, but could feel in the texture of his thoughts. Not suspicion, not the cold calculation of a man deciding whether to execute a psyker who had drawn too deeply on the warp, but something else, something that might, in a different man, have been called awe. The wall held, he said. After you, after what you did, the enemy broke. We held. I did not respond. I could not. My throat was raw from screaming, my mind too exhausted to form words. But I felt something in that moment that I had not felt since the day the black ships came for me. Something I had learned to suppress and ignore and pretend did not exist. Hope. Fragile and painful and dangerous, but hope nonetheless. I had stood at the threshold. I had looked into the abyss, and I had not fallen. Not yet. 37 years have passed since the day the black ships came for me. I have served in 9 regiments across 4 sectors of Imperial space. I have walked the ash wastes of dead worlds and the golden corridors of cardinal palaces. I have killed more souls than I can count, burned more bodies than I can remember, witnessed more horrors than any human mind should be capable of containing. I have felt the touch of the Emperor upon my soul, and the breath of demons upon my neck, and I have endured. Not because I am strong, not because I am special, not because I possess some quality that others lack, but simply because endurance is what remains when everything else has been stripped away. This is what it means to be a sanctioned Psyker of the Imperium of Man. I am old now, by the standards of my kind. Most Psykers do not survive past their 3rd decade of service. The strain of channeling the warp wears upon the body and the mind alike, eroding the barriers that keep us human, fraying the bonds that hold our sanity together. Some burn out, their powers consuming them from within, until nothing remains but ash and the fading echo of a soul. Others fall to corruption, their walls finally breached by the things that have been whispering to them since childhood, their bodies becoming vessels for intelligences that should never have been permitted to wear human flesh. And some simply stop. They wake one morning and discover that the will to continue has left them, that the weight of what they have done and what they have witnessed has finally grown too heavy to bear, and they walk into the fire willingly, seeking the oblivion that service denied them. I have not stopped. I do not know why. Perhaps it is the memory of Ven, that small boy who wept without sound in the holds of the black ship, whose name I have carried for 37 years, as a reminder that even in the darkest places, connection persists. Perhaps it is the echo of my mother's face, wet with tears in the acid rain, her lips forming words I never heard, but have spent a lifetime trying to understand. Perhaps it is simply stubbornness, the refusal to let the darkness claim a victory it has not earned, the determination to remain standing until the universe itself forces me to my knees. Or perhaps it is something else entirely. Perhaps it is the knowledge that I am not alone. Across the million worlds of the Imperium, in ships and hives and fortress monasteries beyond counting, others like me are fighting the same war. Sanctioned Psykers bound to regiments they will never truly belong to, carrying burdens that would crush lesser souls, serving an Imperium that fears them almost as much as it needs them. We do not know each other's names. We will never meet, never speak, never share the stories of what we have endured. But we are connected nonetheless, threads in a tapestry of vigilance that stretches across the stars, candles burning against a darkness that would swallow everything if we ever let our flames go out. I think of them sometimes, in the quiet hours between battles, in the moments when the whispers grow soft enough that I can almost remember what silence felt like. I think of the child on some distant world who is hearing the voices for the first time, who is discovering that they are different, who is beginning the journey that will lead them to the black ships and the Scholastica and the brand upon the soul. I think of the old Psyker on some forgotten battlefield who is fighting their last war, whose barriers are finally failing, who is choosing in their final moments whether to burn clean or fall to corruption. I think of all the souls who came before me, and all the souls who will come after, and I understand that my suffering is not unique, that my service is not special, that I am merely one voice in a chorus that has been singing since the Emperor first ascended to his throne. This is not comfort. Comfort is a luxury the Imperium cannot afford, but it is meaning. And meaning, I have learned, is enough. I have been asked, over the years, if I regret what I am. Soldiers who have served beside me, long enough to see me as something approaching human. Officers who have witnessed my powers and wondered what it must be like to carry such terrible gifts. Even a chaplain once, who sought to understand the spiritual burden of those who walk between worlds. They ask if I wish I had been born normal, if I curse the fate that made me a Psyker, if I would trade everything I am for the chance to be ordinary. I tell them no. This is not a lie, though neither is it the complete truth. I do not regret what I am, because regret implies that there was ever a choice, that some other path existed that I failed to take, that the child I was could have decided to be something other than what the warp made her. There was no choice. There was only the whispers and the fire and the long road that led from a hab block on Mordian to the battlefields of 1,000 worlds. Regret is for those who had options. I had only survival. But I will tell you this, you who listen to my testimony, you who seek to understand what it means to be born wrong in a galaxy that permits no mercy for the different. There is a kind of terrible grace in what we are. Not beauty. I would not insult your intelligence with such a claim. Not justice. For justice is a concept that has no meaning in a universe where children are burned to fuel the Astronomicon. But grace, nonetheless. The grace of purpose, the grace of necessity, the grace of knowing that your suffering serves something greater than yourself. The Emperor needs us. This is the truth that sustains me when all other truths have failed. He needs our cursed gifts, our tainted powers, our souls that burn like candles against the darkness. He needs us to hold the line, to seal the breaches, to fight the enemy in dimensions that ordinary soldiers cannot perceive. He needs us to be weapons, and weapons we have become. Not because we chose it, not because we wanted it, but because there was no other way. Because the alternative was extinction, because humanity could not survive without the very curse that threatens to destroy it. We are paradox made flesh. We are salvation and damnation bound together in the same mortal frame. We are the price the Imperium pays for its continued existence, and we pay that price willingly, not out of faith or devotion or love, but out of the simple understanding that someone must pay it, and it might as well be us. I do not know how much longer I will endure. The whispers grow louder with each passing year. The barriers grow thinner. The flame of my soul flickers in winds that blow from dimensions beyond human comprehension. I feel the warp pressing close, feel the things that hunger for what I am growing bolder in their approaches, feel the inevitable end drawing nearer with each battle I survive. One day, perhaps soon, perhaps not, I will fall. I will burn out or break down or simply cease to be, and my name will be added to the rolls of those who served and died. One more sacrifice among the countless sacrifices that keep the Imperium alive. But not today. Today I still stand. Today I still burn. And tomorrow, when the enemy comes again, and the enemy always comes again, I will be there to meet them. I will reach into the warp and draw forth fire. I will kill and kill and kill until my body fails, or my mind breaks, or the things that whisper finally find their way in. I will serve the Emperor who saved me and damn me in the same breath, who gave me purpose and took my humanity, who needs me and fears me and will never, can never truly trust what I am. This is my life. This is my burden. This is my meaning. I was 11 years old when I first heard the whispers. I am 48 years old now, and I hear them still. A constant chorus of hunger and madness and terrible promise, pressing against the walls of my mind, waiting for the crack through which they might pour. They will never stop. They will never relent. They will whisper to me until the day I die, and perhaps beyond, for the warp does not release its claim upon a soul merely because the flesh has failed. But I have learned something in my 37 years of service, something that the whispers do not want me to know, something that I offer now to any who might find themselves walking the same dark road I have walked. They can be endured. The whispers, the hunger, the darkness that presses close upon the edges of sanity, all of it can be endured, not defeated, not destroyed, not silenced forever, but endured, one day at a time, one battle at a time, one moment at a time. The darkness is vast and patient and eternal, but so too is the light that burns within us, the light that the Emperor kindled and that we carry forward into the night. I am a sanctioned Psyker of the Imperium of man. I am a weapon. I am a curse made useful, a horror sanctified, a door that has chosen to remain closed. And I will endure until the stars themselves grow cold, until the last world falls to silence, until the Emperor's light finally fades and the darkness claims everything that ever was or will be. I will endure. This is my testimony. This is my truth. Let it be remembered.